Let me tell you a little bedtime story before you drift off to sleep. This story involves a young boy caught up in a series of unfortunate events. This young boy was immensely intelligent and had strong ambitions too. He was gifted and had loads of intelligence, a straight A student, with honors, and on the track and field team as well. Had you known his home life, you'd have never guessed he'd be such a high achiever. This young boy's name was Magnus, and he really was the perfect fourth-grade student. At the start of this new school year, though, on the first day of gym class, he noticed 3 kids he had never seen before. Perhaps they were there all along, or perhaps they were new to the school. But they certainly didn't fit in, and no one wanted them on their team during the dodgeball draft. Certainly not Morgan, the toughest student in school, an unofficial school bully. Magnus noticed these 3 outcasts, though. For you see, although Magnus had immense popularity, none of these other kids were his actual friends. They wanted to use him for his social status, and being very self-aware, Magnus knew this. In other words, he hadn't had a true friend. And when this opportunity arose, Magnus took it. He introduced himself to the 3 outcasts, and Magnus soon learned of the difficulties behind Courtney, David, and James. Courtney had come from a broken home and lived with her working-class father in a literal trailer park. Her father wasn't the best parent in the world, and the divorce to Courtney's mother was still fresh, as were the fights. Meanwhile, David was simply neglected by his parents, who cared for him, but both worked 2 jobs and took care of David's brothers and sisters as well, leaving little time for him. And James was sort of the opposite, having strict, overbearing parents, which contributed to his sarcastic mouth and personality. Magnus could relate to their stories, and knew he had found his new closest friends. While Magnus didn't tell them too much about his own issues at home, he could definitely relate to them. Before this, Courtney was made fun of for coming from a trailer park. David was mocked for his weight, being a portly child for his age, and James was made fun of being skinny, weak, and generally unlikable. But all this would change for the 3 of them, having a new protector around, and someone from the top of the social ladder as their closest friend. And so, with Magnus's confidence and popularity, Courtney, David, and James became his new closest friends. Having shared a love of video games, especially with the popular Battling Monsters franchise, the group of friends were dubbed the Elite Four. Although the rest of the school considered it an ironic name, because he was so tough, Magnus retained his popularity in school, while Courtney, David, and James were seen as underlings, flunkies, or lackeys of Magnus, not nearly on the same level of popularity as him. Besides this, Magnus was also pretty tall and wide for his age, appearing older than he really was, while he towered over his shorter friends. Magnus encouraged all 3 of them to join him on the dodgeball team, although none of them wanted to do track and field or wrestling with him. However, by the end of 4th grade, the Elite Four had become school dodgeball champions, with Magnus as their leader and coach. But despite all of this at school, there were a darker side to things at home. You see, Magnus lived alone with his mother, who was verbally abusive, heartless, and an alcoholic. He lived in a situation no child should ever be put in, which explained his school prowess in context. Magnus used his achievements at school to gain love and acceptance from his teachers and colleagues, as a substitute from him not getting it at home. He was a straight A student and a star athlete because it was quite literally the only way he knew to be loved. However, Magnus did have a grandmother who lived a distance away. His mother would try to keep him from seeing his grandmother, but she was the only other small glimmer of hope in his otherwise bleak family. His grandmother encouraged him to continue on doing what he was doing and being the best student he could be. She gave him hope over the phone, where he otherwise might not have had any. It was because of her he was able to become the intelligent star student he became, and he tried to instill this positivity into his 3 friends, who weren't going through as much strife as him, but still needed a helping hand. James was still being verbally bullied by Morgan, although she could no longer physically bully him with Magnus by his side. Eventually, Magnus got her to stop bullying James entirely, and because she both respected Magnus and knew she stood no chance of beating him in a fight, she respected his wishes. The Elite Four continued as friends through 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. By 8th grade, puberty had started to begin for many of the kids in school. Magnus was unchanged, other than now being the top school champion and on the same wrestling team with Morgan, and David and James were only a little different. But Courtney had shot up during the summer and experienced drastic changes from puberty. She had grown breasts and also grown 4 inches in 4 months. She was now almost the same height as Magnus by the start of the fall semester. She tried to avoid coming to class, but Magnus, David, and James, who hadn't seen her since June, eventually learned her secret. Courtney hated her new body and was ashamed to be seen in public, but Magnus and friends comforted her anyway, told her everything was fine, and that she was still their best friend. But Courtney still needed their support, as the rest of the school now noticed the taller and more womanly new Courtney. That was different from last school year. Many of the boys were attracted to her, although they didn't know why yet, and many of the girls hated her with envy, again, not knowing why. It took Magnus's support the most for Courtney to survive the 8th grade. Toward the end of 8th grade, Courtney had a realization. She had fallen deeply in love with Magnus, and with hormones racing, she wanted to be his girlfriend. One day, Courtney met Magnus in the park, wearing a new black dress. She eventually confessed her feelings for him, and how she was deeply in love with him. However, this caught Magnus by surprise, and he told her he didn't feel the same way, and that Courtney was like his sister. This left Courtney heartbroken, and she left the park, drenched in her own tears. While Magnus told her she was like a sister, the full truth was, Magnus himself was envious of Courtney's new body. Not for her figure, but her height. She was closer to adulthood than he was. Magnus hadn't grown at all in a few years now, and he was worried. He felt like he wasn't ready to be the boyfriend of a developing Courtney. Not to mention his own issues with his abusive mother he had kept well hidden from his friends for years now. Magnus tried to apologize to Courtney in school, but this caused a rift between the Elite Four. James, who had developed feelings for Courtney, tried to take her side, while David took Magnus's side. The Elite Four had started to split. Going into high school, the Elite Four were no longer as close as they used to be. Magnus and David went to a more prestigious school, while Courtney and James went to a public school. Despite this, though, David kept in close contact with Courtney and James online, the two of which were now dating by the 11th grade. Meanwhile, Magnus's mother had started to become ill, and her health was deteriorating. But Magnus didn't care about that. He had been trying for years now to solve the problem of his stunted growth. He seemed to remain the same all throughout school, and as he put it, had skipped puberty entirely. This led Magnus to feel like he was losing a grip on his external popularity, and thus his only source of love. His mother had always abused him by telling Magnus he'd never be a real man. Now, Magnus was taking that literally, feeling like his mother's prophecy was coming true. In the 11th grade, Morgan had outgrown Magnus, and now felt like she was the toughest student in school. However, Magnus, becoming desperate and depressed, started to train harder than before, even taking up kickboxing and mixed martial arts, in order to prove his masculinity was still there. One day, Morgan challenged Magnus to a friendly one-on-one fight, now finally being bigger than him. Morgan wasn't serious, thinking Magnus would turn it down like he always had. However, this proved to be a life-changing mistake for Morgan, as Magnus accepted and proceeded to take out some of his frustrations on her, despite being a girl. Magnus underestimated his own skills and overestimated Morgan's, scared her so much in the fight she had to reevaluate her life. This is the point where the rest of the school began to fear Magnus, though he saw it as mockery, thinking everyone else saw him as meek and weak as he saw himself now. Morgan eventually found comfort in the Bible Club and reformed her bullying ways, having now found Jesus in her life following her scare with Magnus. However, Magnus himself continued to be on a downward spiral. The insecurity and fear he saw in others, and kept well hidden in himself, had now taken over. By senior year, he had given up on his schoolwork, as his grades took a nosedive like his confidence. Despite being stronger than ever before, he had now also given up on athletics as well, thinking he was too small to compete. David was his only friend, who had now shot up to 6'4", or 193 centimeters, and was one of the top wrestlers in the city. Magnus was his coach and trainer, although David never understood why Magnus didn't compete with him, being far more skilled than David was. David couldn't understand Magnus's self-doubt and fear, but soon would. Magnus and David, one day, ran into Courtney and James once again, in person. They, too, had grown nearing adulthood. Courtney had stopped growing at 183 centimeters, or 6 feet tall, while James was 186, or 6'1". Both were taller than Magnus, and he loathed them for it. Both Courtney and James were also now newly dating as well, despite Courtney's desires to go into a special kind of movie industry outside of Hollywood. James tried to teach Courtney and himself not to fear Magnus and to stand up to him, but upon the brief reunion, it proved to be futile. Magnus verbally berated the two, similarly to the way Morgan used to all those years ago. Meanwhile, David was unwilling to sacrifice his own success to save Courtney and James from the verbal abuse Magnus's mother taught him so well. Magnus's insecurities and envy was seething into cruelty against the two, who he saw as having stabbed him in the back for outgrowing him. And for their own safety, any high schooler in town stayed away from whoever Magnus's ire was against. It was safer that way for them. After Magnus mocked his two former friends, David followed his master as he left, but looked back at the two with a sad look, as if saying, "I'm sorry." As they left, Courtney sent out a message to David on social media. She asked him to meet her in the park on the weekend. David agreed to do so. So David met Courtney and James. They both told David that they missed their friendship and only wanted things to go back to the way they used to be. David agreed. Courtney asked if Magnus would be willing to set aside their differences on prom night, as James and Courtney weren't even sure why Magnus now hates them. David said he'd ask Magnus if he'd be willing to do the Elite Four reunion for David's school prom. Courtney and James hoped their friendship could be put back together. Meanwhile, Magnus came from another doctor's visit, unsatisfied with the answers he'd gotten, as he sought a cure to figure out what was wrong with him. So the next day, David asked Magnus about the idea of going to the prom. Magnus said how he wasn't sure, as he got bad news, which was no updated news about his poor health. David insisted going to their school's prom would cheer them up, and gave them a chance to accept an apology from Courtney and James. But as soon as he heard those two would be there, he refused to consider it even further. Although no one else knew, Magnus still saw the tall, attractive, near-adult Courtney and James as reminders of his own failure to become a real man, like his mother said. He was envious of them, and sought to keep them down as a defense mechanism for his own emotional pain. So nothing David could say would convince Magnus otherwise. He also forbid David to go, as well. Disappointed, David told Courtney and James over social media that Magnus rejected the proposal, and also didn't want him going to prom either. Courtney and James fought for David to stop obeying Magnus's every word, and finally convinced David to join them for prom, although he didn't have a date. Courtney said the three of them would go as best friends, and that a date wasn't needed. David agreed, and they planned to go to prom night as friends. Courtney, David, and James dubbed themselves the Three Musketeers, and went to David's school prom. However, Magnus already knew they were going to be there, and after the second hour, he made his presence known to them outside the building. Of course, the rest of the school feared Magnus as well, not just the Three Musketeers. At first, Magnus was furious and berated all three of them for their apparent betrayal and causing David to stab him in the back. James tried to finally stand up to Magnus, no longer letting his girlfriend fight his battles for him, only to be promptly punched in the face. Magnus, seeing himself as being a weak child, begged James to fight him for real, but having almost no fight experience, but a lot of bravery, stood no chance against Magnus. Magnus begged James to stop mocking and pitying him, and fight him for real, genuinely believing James could easily win because he was bigger. Eventually, Courtney intervened and got down to the ground on her knees, with her arms behind her, saying how Magnus would have to punch her in the face if he really wanted to be this violent, cruel person he had become. Magnus seemed like he was going to hurt Courtney, but he didn't, causing the fight to end. David just wanted to know what did they all do to make Magnus hate them so much. Magnus began to get watery eyes and told them how he helped them throughout the years. But when he needed their help the most, they were nowhere to be found and opted to leave him behind. Courtney and the others didn't understand what he meant by this, or that he was in some kind of trouble. Magnus decided to leave, as the emotional baggage was too much to bear, and he didn't want to risk crying in front of the three. Magnus speedily walked away, and only began to shed tears once he was far enough from them. He walked the long, dark road home by himself. Magnus did remember the good times he had with his best friends, and wished he could have grown up with them. But he saw himself as a child, and his friends as adults, who left him behind. I didn't know at the time Magnus felt this way, but had I did, I would have followed him and tried to save him, as he did for us throughout the years. Magnus was 178 centimeters tall, a straight-A student up until the 11th grade, an undefeated boxer, and more skilled at Greco-Roman wrestling than his state champion friend David. And Magnus saw all of these things as failures. All he could see was the superficial vanity he once held dear, fading away. His friends, us, never cared how tall he was or how strong he could be in a fight, and we never once saw him as weak in any way. But Magnus couldn't contemplate being anything else but small, inferior, and a failure. His mother corrupted his mind and made him think being a man meant being the toughest, strongest, and best at everything, and his school validated these thoughts in his head. In his mind, he was supposed to become a 6'5" supermarine in order to be worthy of love. And when he didn't become that, he saw his identity slipping away. All we saw, as his friends, was a great guy who one day started hating us and treating us very badly for no reason. Because we finally developed confidence and he was no longer the tallest among us. I honestly couldn't care less how tall he was, how strong he was in a fight, or how macho of a man he was. Those were never the reasons me, Dave, or James were friends. While Magnus saw us as grown adults, too mature, confident, and cool to hang around a little kid anymore, he felt like we'd turned our backs on him, like he was the child who never grew into a man, at least in his eyes. And that was never true. We never even saw him as short, and definitely not childish. I'm just freakishly tall, and so is David, but what we could call normal on him, he would consider a disability and a sign of weakness. It's ironic that one of the things I'd envy about him, he despises with a passion, while he envied something about myself I wished I could change for a very long time. I guess the grass really is greener on the other side. If only we could have explained to him long ago that his thoughts about himself weren't true, assured him that we didn't measure his friendship in feet and inches, or centimeters, or championship trophies, or win streaks, test grades, or popularity points. Meaningless numbers that he thought were the only thing that made him valuable in the world. If only we'd known, paid more attention to him. I mean, we were teenagers, so I guess we couldn't have psychoanalyzed him. But maybe we could have done more to help him feel like he was valued by us all along. I regret the three of us lost a friend and years of time together over something that wasn't even real. I know I could have shown Magnus the truth had I known what he was going through, that he was loved no matter how good he was in school, that he was a man, and that we didn't look down on him all through high school. So that, my dear, is why I tell you every single night that I love you. Some people never have that. Some people never have parents to tell them that they are loved and cared for. Some people are made to believe that they have to be Superman and perfect at everything in order to be appreciated. And you will never have to feel that way. I promise you that, sweetheart. I will never let you feel that way. You will always know that me and your father and Uncle Davy are here for you. Whether you win a game of dodgeball or fail out of school, we will always, always love you. I should check the internet for something. Someone. Good night, honey. Sweet dreams.